Hi! If you're new here, all you need to know is that I have watched the first season of the One Piece live-action adaptation, and now, for the first time ever, I am reading the manga, and, more specifically, the first 100 chapters that the live-action has covered so far. With all of that said, let's begin! Today I'll be covering the chapters in Volume 3, from 18 to 26. The first thing I want to say is a bit unusual, because I want to comment on the cover art for Volume 3. We see Luffy wearing a cool red jacket that looks either similar or the same as the one that Gold Rogers had. From the live action, I already know that these two characters are painted as very similar to each other, so this cover looks like early foreshadowing for that. The actual chapter 18 picks up right where Volume 2 ended, and that is Buggy mentioning Shanks. Luffy asking Buggy where is he now stood out to me in a very sad way. Luffy doesn't need to spell it out, but you can see how much he actually misses Shanks. Also, it's interesting that this doesn't happen in the live action, and Luffy doesn't even try asking Buggy if he knew where Shanks was. Another small difference is that in the live action, Buggy recognized Luffy's hat, but in the manga, he actually thought that Luffy himself was similar to Shanks, while the hat was only a little familiar. It feels like the story is painting parallels between three different generations: Gold Rogers, Shanks, and Luffy, so I'm really excited to get more information about the first two at some point. I love how Buggy started playing mind games, saying that maybe he knows and maybe he doesn't, and Luffy just asked if Buggy was an idiot. Luffy always says whatever is on his mind, and later in this volume, that comes up again multiple times in the funniest ways. The live action also showed this quality, only in different scenes than the manga, and also in a little bit toned down manner. Then, Luffy and Buggy fought with no interference from the others, while in the live action the fight was a group effort. While the fights played out differently, I liked them both. I find the manga version of Buggy a bit more entertaining than the live-action one. For example, his attacks' names were really funny, like Chop Chop Quick Dodge or Chop Chop Quick Escape. The live-action Buggy felt more menacing. The part where he chained the townspeople up and forced them to clap and laugh was so chilling. Plus, I really enjoyed the actor's performance and delivery. The manga Buggy is still menacing, but it comes from how unstable he seems. But mostly he's just funny and entertaining rather than scary. I also loved the small addition of Buggy's crew pretending to be unconscious. It was a small but effective comedy bit. Next, Luffy's hat is damaged, and he gets very angry. I love that Buggy, just like he did with Mayor Boodle, mocks Luffy for calling something like this a treasure. Despite being a clown, Buggy looks like the most stereotypical pirate in this story so far. Buggy prioritizes gold and jewels, while Luffy gets angry about a hat or Buggy talking badly about Shanks. I think the live action had a beautiful scene that summed it all up perfectly. When the map to the Grand Line and Luffy's hat fell in different directions, while Buggy crawled to the map, Luffy chose the hat without a second thought. Before I discuss more serious stuff, I must address the elephant in the room and talk about Luffy's unorthodox fighting tactics. When I talk about One Piece story in general, I love how creative Luffy is in how he uses his powers. It's just one simple ability, yet he keeps finding new ways to use it. Even earlier in chapter 18, when Buggy caught Luffy's arm and threatened to sever it, Luffy, instead of trying to bring his arm back, launched his body itself at Buggy. But his creativity doesn't end with how he uses his powers. In this fight, we see Luffy punching Buggy in the balls, then later on kicking that same spot. Then he even snatched Buggy's foot and tickled it, pinched his skin, grated his toes over the ground, and so on. This is smart on Luffy's part. In fights, there's no time to make them pretty. You have to strike where it hurts the most, but there are very few stories that actually utilize this. Also, not only was watching Luffy destroy Buggy's balls entertaining, but it also felt like poetry. In earlier chapters, we saw Buggy proudly shoot his special Buggy balls from a cannon at an innocent town, so I guess that's the karma he gets for all of that. One more tiny detail that I really loved was how Luffy mocked Buggy by coming up with a new name for an attack. Luffy said, "Chop chop don't come apart," as he continued clobbering Buggy. The scene briefly jumps to the townspeople. I've made a similar point before, but I like how they are active participants of the story. Their mentality was beautiful. Either none of them go and fight, or all of them do. Just like the mayor tried fighting for them, the people decided to fight for the mayor. The fact that Oda doesn't ignore stories like these makes the world of One Piece feel more alive. I understand the live action cutting out things like this because a more streamlined story works better with that medium, but some magic was, unfortunately, lost because of that. Next, we get a thing that made me very happy, and that is a flashback to Shanks and Buggy's past. In the live action, Buggy only vaguely talked about Shanks betraying him and keeping him away from the spotlight. Watching the live action, I believed it had to be something ridiculous and not that serious. But I honestly didn't expect the manga to actually give us a full flashback instead of just vague statements. First of all, I find it a bit funny that earlier, Buggy said that Luffy wouldn't get any information from him, and yet now he shared the entire honest story. To be fair, there was no way to weave in this flashback into the story naturally, so at least that itself was turned into a joke. Anyway, like I suspected, the backstory and the reason why Buggy hates Shanks was utterly ridiculous. But even more importantly, there were so many interesting little details. The first one was that the map that Buggy found led to a vast fortune sunken deep on the ocean floor. It wasn't a generic map to a generic fortune. Something this specific, in my opinion, might mean a little more and come back later in the story. Also, in episode 6 of the live action, Nami read this story about a guy named Noland and how he spoke about a city of gold that sank into the sea. This might be just a coincidence, but I feel like these two things are related. As always, please no spoilers. Another thing that I liked was the conversation between Shanks and Buggy about becoming pirate captains. Shanks prioritized seeing the world over piracy. Him and Luffy share that in common. They are both pirates not just for the sake of piracy, but because it's the best path to have adventure and meet new, interesting people. In this conversation, Shanks also mentioned that the devil fruits were enchanted by sea devils. I might be forgetting things, but I don't think this specific piece of information was shared in the live action. This feels like a small piece of world building that will eventually come back and we'll get to know more about these mysterious sea devils. I also find it interesting that the fruit, apparently, is worth 100 million berries, which is the exact same number that Arlong asked for Nami's village. I'm probably overanalyzing things again, but this stood out to me. I think this shows one of two things. It either emphasizes just how valuable a single fruit is if a whole village is worth the same, or it shows how absurd Arlong's demands were. Another small detail I liked was that Buggy mentioned how he'll put together the cruelest pirate crew ever. Once again, it emphasizes the difference between him and Luffy or Shanks. Those two prioritize loyalty and goodness of the crew, while Buggy thinks the only important thing is cruelty. And finally, we get to the actual accident that made Buggy hate Shanks. Apparently, it was greed that got the best of Buggy. He wanted to steal the map and the fruit all for himself and lost both in the process. And his default reaction was shifting the blame to someone else. I feel like it was greed that also made him lose against Luffy so badly. Instead of focusing on beating him, Buggy aimed for Nami, who was trying to retreat with his treasure, and because his focus was so split, Luffy easily destroyed him. At the end of chapter 19, there was some extra information where the author said that the original name for Buggy was supposed to be Boogie, and I love the small detail that the live action referenced that by having Luffy refer to Buggy as Boogie, in addition to all the other wrong names he used. The main thing that stood out to me in chapter 20 was the direct confrontation between Nami and Buggy and how they argued about thievery. Nami's action felt uncharacteristically stupid, but I believe the main point of that scene was to show that she has more in common with Luffy and Zoro than we may initially think. When it comes to the things she is passionate about, she can get almost just as stubborn and thick-skulled as the other two. I also think we can draw some parallels between Buggy and Nami and how they both prioritize treasure. What makes all the difference in the world is their reactions. Buggy hates Shanks for saving his life, but Nami, despite the fact that all her treasure got scattered all over the place because of the fight, still thanked Luffy for saving her. And even later on, when Luffy left half of the treasure for the town on purpose, it felt like Nami, despite shouting and complaining, was okay with that decision. She was offered the opportunity to go back for the treasure, but she didn't. Once again, I think her sympathy played a role here, because the poor town was just like her own village, even if that information isn't yet revealed in the manga. The last thing I have about this fight is that in the end, it ended up being more similar to the live action than I thought it would be. Because Luffy, for the most part, was fighting alone, I thought that it couldn't end the same way as it did in the live action, but since Nami had to join at the end, the resolution to the fight ended up being similar, finding a way to restrain majority of Buggy's body parts before Luffy sends the rest of him flying. Except here it was rope instead of crates, plus Zoro was asleep. I really loved chapter 21. After all the fighting, a chill chapter like this was really needed. I adored the group dynamics of our crew. When I spoke about the live action, at some point I said that I loved how much chemistry all the cast members had. But even without that, even if it's just 2D black and white drawings on paper, these characters still have incredibly enjoyable chemistry. In the beginning of this review, I spoke about how Luffy never plays any mind games and always says whatever he thinks. And here, it comes back as he confesses to the townspeople that he was the one to knock out the mayor and that they are pirates. I also love that Zoro was just laughing at the whole situation. But even with how ridiculous the scene was, the author still managed to sneak in something emotional, and that is Luffy saying how the people are angry because they love their mayor, because they are good people, and that in the end, it wouldn't matter what Luffy told them in that moment. It doesn't matter if I talk about the manga or the live action, the most beautiful quality of Luffy is his positivity. Even here, while being chased by an angry mob, his takeaway was only positive. Then Cho-Cho came back to defend our crew. When it comes to this whole Buggy arc, I must say that in my opinion, the live action executed this conflict just as well as the manga, even if many things were different. But it was precisely Cho-Cho's story that elevated this arc in the manga to a completely new level for me. When it comes specifically to the manga, this was probably my favorite plotline so far. But because I've seen the live action, I know that soon we'll get into stories I love even more, like Sanji and Jeff or Nami's story. But going back to chapter 21, I also enjoyed the comeback from the pirates that Nami had swindled. Once again, a single angry glare from Zoro sent them running, or, more specifically, swimming away. Then we got a very sweet scene of the mayor thanking Luffy and the others. Overall, I love how light-hearted and sweet the ending to this arc was. One last minor difference in the live action was that our crew all used Nami's stolen ship, while here they kept two separate boats. I don't think it will end up coming into play in any way. It was probably simply easier to shoot in the live action if you only had a single boat. Before getting into Usopp's arc, we got a side story about Gaimon. This was completely cut from the live action. I know that the live action had many references to the manga that I missed on my first watch, and I might rewatch the show after reading the manga, so I wouldn't be surprised if Gaimon and this island was also referenced in some way, but the story as a whole was cut. I loved it more than I thought I would. For as ridiculous as it was, it still ended up being pretty emotional and very sweet. I loved the reveal that the treasure chests were empty and that this is something that happens often. It kind of ties back to Buggy's flashback. He hates Shanks for losing the map, but who knows? That map might have led to nothing as well. In theory, even the One Piece treasure itself could be empty. No one really knows, and that's the point. It's about the hope and the chase, not the result. I also loved that even after knowing the truth, Gaimon refused to leave because he grew fond of the forest and the animals over the years. I think there's a beautiful lesson here. Dreams are important, yes, but so is what's in front of you. The funniest part was that Zoro slept through all of it. I don't think it was intentional, but I believe he was the one who needed to hear that story and that lesson more than anyone else. I feel like in the live action, his fight and loss against Mihawk carried a similar lesson. Zoro, all for the hope that he could reach his dream, ignored what was in front of him, which is his crew begging him not to fight because they valued their friendship and didn't want to lose him. Another small detail I want to point out is that I loved how Luffy said he was scared of being shot. In the live action, he often looked simply fearless. So here it was nice to get a scene where he admitted he still had normal human emotions and responses, even if he knew he couldn't be hurt by bullets. The whole world building and the hype for the Grand Line that happened in this chapter was split into many separate scenes in the live action, but the overall takeaway is the same. Other than that, I don't have much to say about this chapter, but I still enjoyed the side story very much. I know this place might feel a bit random, but I want to talk about the hat. In the beginning of chapter 22, we see Nami fixing Luffy's hat the same way it happened in the live action once the fight against Buggy was over. But here, Nami also mentions that the hat will be fine if Luffy isn't too rough with it. Which raises a question. Will this hat survive until the end of the story, despite all the fights and action? My current guess is that yes, it will. I think it will become a symbol that no matter how rough things get, they can still be fixed just like the hat. Another thing I want to talk about is the origins of the hat. We know Luffy got it from Shanks, but Shanks said that this hat means a lot to him. So I'm wondering if perhaps he also got it from someone that was important to him. He already had it in Buggy's flashback, so if my theory is correct, then I think something should have happened even earlier in his life, something that influenced his personality in a positive manner. But let's move on to the second half of this volume, which is the beginning of Usopp's arc. I found the last 4 chapters in this volume very fun. Things are already playing out quite differently than they did in the live action, so I'm curious to see where it all goes. But let's look at everything in a chronological order. Chapter 23 starts with our crew trying to make a plan. I love everyone's priorities. Luffy thinks about bringing more food, Zoro thinks about bringing more drinks, and Nami's the only one who's being practical. Then we see Usopp for the first time, and one thing immediately stood out to me. In the live action, we were given quite a tragic reasoning for why he keeps lying about the pirates. But here in the manga, the only reason we were given so far is that he simply does that for excitement. While the manga could give a deeper meaning for Usopp's lies later on, at the moment I'm leaning more towards the theory that this was one of the changes in the live action. But as always, don't confirm or deny anything yet. Then we meet Pepper, Carrot and Onion, and they are such a delightful addition to the story. That's probably the first thing that the live action removed that I think they should have kept. Their existence alone makes Usopp a much more likable character from the get-go. While all the villagers are annoyed, these kids admire Usopp, because for them, his lies aren't something bad. The kids play into his lies enthusiastically, because for them, those stories are real adventures that bring a lot of joy, and I think it's beautiful. Also, before I forget, I want to mention a small random detail that I spotted the name Mikio again on a magazine that one of the villagers was reading. Now I'm pretty sure that it's nothing more than some kind of a fun Easter egg, something like, can you count how many times that name appears in this story? The next scene is our crew meeting Usopp, and that whole sequence was once again filled with snappy and effective comedy, like Zoro spotting Usopp and the kids with no problem, or Usopp coming up with new absurd lies in each sentence, like saying he has 80 million men prepared to fight, and then calling Nami a master of interrogation for calling out those obvious lies. In the live action, the first meeting happened at the docks, where Usopp worked because Kaya's parents gave him a job there. But in the manga, there is no mention of anything remotely close to that so far, so I suspect that thing was an original addition for the show. Then we move on to chapter 24, and the 3 kids continue being a wonderful addition to the story. I love how they were scared that Usopp got eaten by our crew, and Zoro, after he noticed that, decided to play into that. The manga version of Zoro so far feels like such a troll. Sure, in the live action he also made jokes often enough, but in the manga, this quality feels more pronounced and I'm really enjoying it. While I am still on the topic of the 3 kids, one of them called Usopp a meddler. I feel like it might be significant. At this point in the manga, Usopp is portrayed as someone who's a little bit cowardly, but the word meddler feels so specific, like we might see Usopp always getting involved when he sees some kind of injustice. That's not really something that I noticed in the live action, so I'm not very firm on this theory. The main thing when it comes to Usopp's meddling is, obviously, cheering up Kaya with his stories. It's the same in both the manga and the live action, except in the manga, his stories cheer up not only Kaya, but also bring some joy to the kids. But from this point and onward, the manga and the live action deviate even more. In the manga, there is no fancy dinner. Instead, there is a very heated conversation in the garden. Plahador is much more brutal in how he talks to Usopp, provoking him to the point where Usopp punches him. My personal favorite part about this confrontation was Usopp saying he'll never lie about his pirate heritage and also saying that he's proud that his father is a brave warrior of the sea. In the live action, This specific line doesn't come up until the very last episode, so it's nice to get that additional context that Usopp dreams of becoming a brave warrior of the sea because that's what he thinks his father is. I really appreciate that this whole heated confrontation was wrapped up with some light-hearted comedy. More specifically, Luffy prepared to fight Klahadore alongside the three kids and Zoro holding him back. The author always strikes this good balance between the heavy stuff and something fun, making both stand out even more. Next scene was the conversation between Kaya and Klahadore, and I have to admit that I found his story genuinely convincing. The live action made it obvious he was a villain the second he was introduced, but in the manga, despite all the horrible things he'd said to Usopp, I would probably believe he was a good but complicated guy if I didn't already know the plot. I think the most genius move was giving him a fake backstory. Even at this point in the manga, I can already see that the author loves using flashbacks and backstories to write his characters. In general, I really love the storytelling technique where you set up a certain pattern and then eventually break it for the sake of a twist, and it's exactly what the author did here. Next we meet Django, a character not included in the live action, and so far I'm enjoying him a lot. He simply has a very entertaining personality and design. The conversation between Usopp and Luffy about Yasopp in the live action played out a little differently. I love that in the manga, Luffy recognizes Usopp on his own. In the live action, it felt a little bit random when Yasopp's name was brought up, so I think it was handled better in the manga. However, there is one thing that the live action added that I think improved on this scene, and that is showing how upset Usopp is that his dad was hanging out with some random kid after abandoning his own son. The manga showed none of those conflicting feelings, so personally, I like the live-action version of this scene just a bit more. Immediately after that, things escalate really quickly, because Usopp and Luffy overhear the real plan from Kuro. The live-action changed a lot with it. The reveal happened during a conversation with Mary and not Django. At this point in the manga, we only saw Mary in a couple of panels and technically he wasn't even officially introduced yet. I feel like there are many small changes that are slowly compounding, so I believe this whole arc will probably be the most different compared to what I saw in the live action. My personal favorite part of this conversation in the manga was Kuro explaining why he's trying to steal Kaya's fortune by pretending to be a butler and not by force. It's because he wants the riches but doesn't want to live like a fugitive. I must admit that I feel really stupid because in the live action I completely failed to put two and two together. When Kuro, during his fight against Luffy, was talking about how pirates are always on the run, never able to trust anyone, I just didn't get it that he was explaining the reason why he was playing the long game now, working as a butler for 3 years, just so that he can inherit the fortune eventually. But I think it was more of an oversight from my side and not the show's fault, because technically all the information was right there in front of me. But going back to the manga, this scene had a few more details that I really liked. First, I absolutely loved the exchange when Kuro told Django, "If my plan succeeds, you'll get what you deserve," which was already sinister enough because we, as readers, clearly see the double meaning of this promise. But then the author doubled down on that by having Django reply to that, "If it's murder, then I'm your man." That's a very direct and obvious setup, but the phrasing itself felt very impactful. Another detail I liked was Kuro calling himself a pacifist and saying that he's gone legitimate. I'm also intrigued by the circumstances around Kaya's parents' deaths, because Kuro acts as if that was not a part of the plan. My current theory is that they found out who Kuro truly was and what he was planning, so Kuro was forced to kill them. Unless I forgot something, then the live action completely skipped any explanation for that, so I am curious to finally uncover the truth. I'm guessing in the next volume. Next, the scene switches to Luffy being Luffy and revealing himself, as well as the fact that he's heard the entire plan. Luffy was taken out from the early stages of this conflict in both the manga and the live action, but in the live action it was by poison, while here it was because he got hypnotized. Seeing Luffy fall from a cliff was pretty chilling, even if we know he is made of rubber and will be completely fine. Also, the mechanics of how he survives in this case make more sense than him also being resistant to poison. And I don't know. Perhaps the devil fruit really does give him an immunity to poisons, but I guess the live action didn't really explain how he actually survived drinking that whole pot of poisoned soup. After seeing a highly distressed Usopp, the kids and our crew immediately understood that something must be wrong. Zoro asked for the directions to the beach where Luffy is. Assuming he actually finds the place and doesn't get lost on the way, I'm afraid he might get a bit of a PTSD, since falling down on the head is exactly how Kuina died. I'm only half joking here. And that's where Volume 3 ends. Overall, I think it was very entertaining. While my favorite scenes still come from Volume 2, and that is Chocho's story, at no point did this volume get boring. There were plenty fun moments that made me genuinely grin, and there were also plenty of sweet and heartfelt moments. I'll admit that in the live action, Kuro was my least favorite villain out of all the villains we got to meet in Season 1. What made me enjoy those 2 episodes in the show were the character interactions, particularly between Kaya and Nami, plus the beautifully edited scene where Zoro's struggle to climb out of the well was combined with his flashbacks about Kuina was one of my favorite scenes in the entire season. Obviously, in the manga, this arc will play out very differently. Our characters aren't locked in a mansion, at least not yet. We already had Zoro's flashbacks in Chapter 5. The story still needs to introduce and somehow build up Mary's character before he dies. There are no marines here. The pirates will attack from the harbor and not from within the house, and many more differences. Because of that, I almost feel like I'm going into this arc blind, despite knowing that the outcome will obviously be the same. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Please share your own thoughts in the comments, and if you are interested, I'll see you in the next part as I review Volume 4.